What's going on, Nasteey Nation? It's Nasteey, and in today's video I'll be going over my in-depth guide to playing Rakan in Season 10. This guide is going to go over abilities, runes, builds, skill order, matchups, combos, and many more things that'll help you take your Rakan to the next level. With all that being said, be sure to leave a like on the video if you do go on to enjoy it or find it helpful. Be sure to drop a comment down below letting me know what champion you'd like to see me do a guide for next, and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Well, that should just about do it for this little introduction, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Before you master anything in life, you first need to get a good understanding of the basics. That same concept applies to League of Legends and mastering a champion, which is why we're starting off this guide with a rundown on Rakan's abilities and max order. Rakan's passive is Fey Feathers. After a short period of time, Rakan will gain a shield that regains its strength if not entirely broken. This passive allows Rakan to be slightly tankier and harder to kill whenever setting up engages for his team. Try to keep it in mind as much as you can and play around it, because although the shield may seem small, it can sometimes be the difference maker. If Rakan is paired with a Xayah on his team, his passive also has two additional features. The first of which allows Rakan to have an increased jump range on his E when jumping to Xayah, and the other allows Rakan and Xayah to sync their recalls together for a shorter back. This can be extremely useful for recalling in the early game and getting back to lane quicker. Rakan's Q is Gleaming Quill. When used, Rakan shoots forward a feather connecting with the first target it reaches. Landing this ability on an enemy will heal Rakan after a short period of time, or after he becomes in contact with an allied champion. This ability can be used in the lane phase to sustain while also poking down the enemy. Rakan's W is Grand Entrance. When used, Rakan dashes forward, knocking up all enemies within the radius after a brief pause. This ability is kind of the bread and butter of Rakan's kit, making him one of the most mobile and efficient engage supports in the entire game. This ability alone allows Rakan to be very diverse in the sense that it allows him to engage peel and even disengage while having the mobility left over from his E. Rakan's E is Battle Dance. This ability has two charges, which allows Rakan to dash to an ally and shield that ally upon arrival. This ability is mainly used for the sake of mobility, but the shield on top of it is always a nice plus. Use this ability throughout the game in order to dash to allies and gap close on the enemy. Do keep in mind though that when dashing to an ally, you will always end up on the back side of them. Rakan's ultimate is the Quickness. When used, Rakan will gain a burst of movement speed and charm any enemy he comes into contact with. The first enemy Rakan hits will also grant him an additional burst of movement speed. Rakan can use all of his other abilities while his ultimate is activated, but only after a half-second delay. When comboed with his W, these abilities can make for some insane CC chains. More on combos later on in the video. Now for skill order, there are two skill orders for Rakan, and they are both very viable but include very different playstyles. The first of the two skill orders is the one that I personally prefer, and that is the WEQ max order. Maxing W first allows Rakan to engage more often, maxing E second allows for more mobility to pull off these engages, and maxing Q last just makes it so that the focus is less on healing your teammates and more on setting up plays for them. This max order embodies a much more aggressive playstyle and has kind of a I want to be the one to carry the game kind of mentality. On top of that, this max order has consistently been the highest win rate for Rakan ever since his release, and you simply can't argue against those numbers. On the other hand, there is the QEW skill order. Now this skill order isn't one that I'm particularly a fan of, but practically every challenger support main in the world is running this skill order. Maxing Q first allows people to poke and sustain more throughout the lane phase, maxing E second makes for larger shields, and maxing W makes it so that the priority is more on buffing up your teammates and less on engaging. This max order embodies a somewhat safer playstyle that relies on putting teammates in a position to carry, rather than being the one to try to carry the game for yourself. Again, I'm not personally a fan of this max order or playstyle, but if all the pros and challenger players are consistently doing it, even when the other max order has a higher win rate, then they must know something that I don't. Now for runes. Although Rakan has a lot of variation in his kit and playstyle among other things, his rune page isn't one that necessarily has too much diversity. For Rakan's rune page, you're going to want to start in the Resolve tree with Guardian as your keystone. Rakan is one of the very few, if not the only engaged champion in the game that doesn't also double as a tank. As a result, he relies a lot on his rune page to get additional stats and buffs that'll help him survive longer in fights. Guardian helps a lot with this problem by providing a decently sized shield when near an ally in fights. To finish off the Resolve tree, there is Demolish, Bone Plating, and Revitalize. Demolish really isn't the best rune for Rakan, but it's the best of the three choices here, and it still comes in handy from time to time. Bone Plating will once again help Rakan with his defensive problems that I was just mentioning, and Revitalize helps increase the effectiveness of his Q and his E. In the secondary tree, I'd recommend going into Sorcery with Nimbus Cloak and Celerity. Nimbus Cloak grants additional movement speed after casting your ultimate, and Celerity will boost all movement speed bonuses. Both of these runes are essential to helping Rakan engage more efficiently. To finish off the rune page, I'd recommend 2 adaptive force runes and 1 armor rune just to add some extra damage and defensive stats. Next up, let's talk about Rakan's build path. With the addition of the new support items in Season 10, Rakan now has a couple of different options to start off the game. If you have a favorable lane matchup and you want to play aggressive early and look for kills, then I'd recommend starting the game off with Spell Thief's Edge. This item will make you a little squishier, but it'll add some extra damage that may very well help you land some kills in the early game and thus snowball the game in your favor. On the other hand, if your lane matchup isn't the best, or if you're just looking to go even in the lane, then you can opt to start with the Relic Shield. Relic Shield will allow you to be a bit tankier and have a steady gold income, while still having the opportunity to play safe. And then again, if you happen to find yourself in a game in which you just still don't know which item to start with, then I would just recommend that you start the game with Relic Shield because it does have a slightly higher pick rate and win rate. For boots, you have 2 main options as Rakan. You can either boost your ability to engage by getting mobility boots, or boost your ability to survive after engaging by getting Merc Treads. Both of these options are viable. I personally prefer Merc Treads, most people prefer mobility boots, but it's a preference thing more than anything else. Following your support item and your boots, you'll want to get started on what I consider to be Rakan's core build. This core consists of Zeke's, Redemption, and Locket in that order. And if you happen to get to the 6th item in your build path, you can choose between Ardent Sensor, Shrela's, or Knight's Vow, just depending on the game situation. All of these items together grant Rakan the CDR defensive stats and the item actives that allow him to completely dominate teamfights and take over games. So since I was just talking about matchups and which ones are good and which ones are bad, I guess now would be a good time to talk about counter picks. For starters, Rakan excels most when picked into immobile ADCs or caster supports. This includes ADCs such as Jinx and Ashe, and supports such as Nami and Soraka. ADCs that lack mobility make Rakan's job of engaging much easier, and caster supports simply don't have the peel needed to repel Rakan off of their carries. On the other hand, Rakan will struggle against mobile ADCs and poke supports. This includes ADCs like Lucian and Ezreal, and supports like Xerath and Vel'Koz. Mobile ADCs make engaging as Rakan extremely difficult, and poke supports can easily whittle down Rakan's health before he ever gets the opportunity to engage. In the gray area, you'll find the utility and engage supports. This includes champions like Taric or Alistar, who Rakan can pretty much just match evenly. Next up, let's talk about the early game and the lane phase as Rakan. When Rakan was initially released into the game, he was quite the lane bully, but changes over the years have caused him to be a little lackluster these days. Now don't get me wrong, Rakan isn't necessarily weak in the lane phase, but he's also just not very strong. Rakan is the type of champion that has potential to both win or lose the lane phase, but more times than not he'll just end up going even and end up playing for the mid to late game where he can group up with his team and set up for team fights. Before you can get there though, you have to at least survive the lane phase, so here are some tips for laning as Rakan. Focus on sustaining with your Q. It may not look like it does a lot of healing, but over time it does make a big difference. Don't try to trade with ranged supports auto for auto. Even though Rakan has a bit of a longer range than most melee supports, it's not quite long enough to comfortably go for these trades. You can, however, go for some auto trades if your Q is up because the heal will make up the difference, but if your Q is on cooldown, it's best to just hang back behind the minions. If your ADC gets engaged on by the enemy support, focus the attention on the enemy ADC, not the support. If the enemy ADC has mobility, be sure to wait for them to use it before trying to knock them up with your W. If you're looking to engage on the enemy, hang out towards the front of the wave and look to W forward when they go for a last hit on the minion. While going for the last hit on the minion, they'll be standing completely still for just a split second, making it much easier for you to land your W and engage on them. Another way you can engage on the enemy is by actually hanging back and having your ADC be the one to stand closer by the front of the wave. By positioning so far back, the enemy won't feel threatened by an engage, but you can still very easily get to them by using your E onto your ADC before gap closing on the enemy with your W to engage. This works increasingly well with Xayah due to that increased jump range. And finally, the last tip that I have for the early game is to be sure to utilize Rakan's mobility to roam around the map and help other lanes get an early lead. With that perfectly executed segue, let's now talk a little bit more about how to properly roam as Rakan. Rakan has unique roaming potential in the sense that he can gank from lane and from the river. If you run from base, you may find yourself going through the lane, and if you roam from bot lane, chances are you'll come through the river. Whichever route you decide to take, you'll typically want to open up by using your E on an ally to gap close to the enemy. However, if you happen to be closer to the enemy than your ally is, then you'll of course just run straight at the enemy. Either way, once you're close enough to the enemy to get an engage off, open up with your ultimate. The goal here is to either run through the enemy with R for the charm and then W, or just W on them if they try to flash away. This fully extended Rakan combo can be riskier in the later stages of the game, but when just going for one target, it works more times than not. Next up, let's go over the mid to late game and team fighting as Rakan. This is without a doubt the strongest aspect of Rakan's gameplay, however, it is the trickiest. As Rakan, you only really have one opportunity to engage and make that big play for your team, so you have to make it count. Always be sure to keep an eye on the minimap and keep an eye out for where your teammates are, because you have to be able to pull the trigger when your team is ready to follow up, or else your engage is just gonna go to waste. I only really have one piece of advice when it comes to team fighting in the late game as Rakan, and that is to be patient. Again, you only have one opportunity, so you have to make it count. At this stage of the game, you really don't want to be going for that fully extended combo that I was just talking about, where you use your R, walk through the enemy, and then use your W. Doing so takes too long, and chances are with 5 people on you, you're just going to get bursted down immediately. Instead, the combos that you want to go for here are going to be kind of a long range setup. Usually want to use your R from a little bit off the screen, get that movement speed going, and then W onto the enemy, or R flash W, or even R then use your E to jump to an ally, and then W onto the enemy. Those are going to be your main combos, and those are going to be your main ways of setting up team fights in the late game and winning the game for your team. Well, alright then, ladies and gentlemen, that should just about wrap up this in-depth guide to playing Rakan in Season 10. Again, if you guys did go on to enjoy the video or find it helpful, be sure to leave a like on the video, drop a comment down below letting me know what champion you'd like to see me do a guide for next, and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Thank you guys so much for watching to the end of this video. I really do appreciate it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.